When we talk about faith, prayer, our relationship with God, we have frequently used the metaphor of the journey. Our spiritual life is like a journey in the sense that it hopefully involves progress. Things change along the way. We are moving toward a destination. And, like any journey, there will probably be detours, delays, potholes along the way. When you made the decision to be part of this cohort program, you made an important decision to take your spiritual life more seriously. You set out on a journey toward a transformative relationship with God. But over the years, you have probably found that there have been periods in your life in which God seemed farther away, when it was hard to find time for prayer, when you struggled in your faith life. As you continue through this cohort, you may experience times of resistance, times when you don't want to look at the issues we're addressing. There may be times when you feel like it is impossible to carve out the time and energy to pray or focus on the material. There may be times when you sincerely want to pray, to become closer to God, but God just seems to be absent. These are just some examples of how we all get bogged down on the spiritual journey. The reality is that the goal of the spiritual journey is transformation. We are being called to be completely remade, to become a new creation in Christ. That isn't an easy process. It takes hard work. It takes self-awareness and honesty. It takes a long time. And the ability to work hard, to be self-aware, honest, and patient are characteristics that most of us could use help with. But it helps to be able to identify and understand some of the potholes, detours, and obstacles on our journey to transformation. Talking about struggles in the spiritual life is a huge topic, but we can at least mention some of the key issues in order to provide an introduction to the common challenges we may face. We will discuss two broad categories of difficulties in the spiritual journey. First, we will delineate some of the common psychological problems that we all face as we seek to deepen our spiritual lives. Second, we will discuss the issues of the dark night and dryness in prayer that are common as people advance in their relationship with God. So to start with the idea of psychological issues in the spiritual journey, we have to go back to one of the basic premises of modern psychology, the idea of the ego. Psychology says that our basic self-understanding and sense of ourself in relationship to the world is described as the ego, the I. The ego, our sense of self, is critical to our ability to function in the world. The ego, the I, is what allows us to think we are in control of our lives, that we can determine what happens to us. The ego helps us to understand and experience ourselves as worthy and competent. It is our ego, our sense of self, that allows us to function in the world as independent people. The problem of the ego, our sense of self, is that it tends to be too big or too little. An inflated ego means that we tend to be arrogant, overbearing, grandiose, proud. We think we're bigger than we really are. On the other hand, if someone does not have a sufficiently healthy ego, then they think that they are unworthy, inadequate, not capable. Most everyone falls somewhere on this spectrum of inflated or inadequate sense of self. It seems to be part of the human condition. The key for understanding all of this is to understand that it is our natural human tendency to see ourselves as the center of the universe. If our ego is inflated, we think we're much greater than we really are. This is what we usually think of when we say that someone is egotistical. But, and this is important, the lack of an adequate ego, what we usually call poor self-esteem, also means that we tend to think of ourselves as the center of the universe. When we have a poor self-image, we think that we are much worse, much less competent, much more guilty and inadequate than anyone else. In other words, we are still the center of the universe. It is all about us and our limitations and our unworthiness. The other critical thing to know about the ego, our sense of self, is that it is the source of our sense of control. The ego is what determines our perception of reality. Now, what does that mean? It just means that all of us are sure that our reality is the only reality. How I see and understand things is how they really are. Remember, I'm the center of the universe. And so if someone has a very different interpretation of the same facts or events than I do, then obviously it is that person who is wrong. Depending on whether someone has an inflated ego or an inadequate sense of self will determine how they perceive their world. The person who has an inflated ego is sure that he or she is the master of his or her fate. They say, I'm extremely competent, more so than those other people. Of course I will prevail. That's an arrogant, egotistical person. But even a pretty healthy, competent person, in other words, most of us, will think that she has a lot of control over her life circumstances. It is normal to think that if I work hard, do a good job, treat people well, I will advance and be rewarded. That is what an average, psychologically healthy person is justified in thinking. Most of the time, that probably is our reality. On the other end of the spectrum, the person who does not have a strong enough ego, someone whose ego tells her she is much worse than others, is unworthy or inadequate in so many ways, is very invested in this negative view of reality. If you tell someone like this that she is actually very competent, smart, good-looking, etc., she will insist that this is not the case. She has become extremely invested in the negative reality that comes from her ego. So this is important and difficult stuff. It might help to understand by thinking about people you know. We have probably all known or known about people who are extremely self-confident and arrogant. Maybe we've seen celebrities who are like this. They just think they're the greatest thing, and it doesn't seem to matter what anyone says or whatever happens. They are stubbornly convinced that they are great. That is their reality. We may look at that person and say, what on earth is he or she thinking? What a jerk. And it wouldn't matter to them. They are the center of the universe, and they are wonderful. Now, let's think of someone who really suffers from low self-esteem, who doesn't think she is worth much. If you know someone like this, or if you've been this person, you know what it is like to give her a compliment or to try to boost her sense of self. You say, oh, that's not true. Of course you are smart and capable and pretty and nice, etc., etc. And does saying this make any difference? Probably not. That this person is so invested in her image of herself as inadequate that she can't let go of that image and start to see herself in a new way. Both of these people don't want to give up their perception of reality. For each of us, our perception of reality is rooted in our sense of control. If I'm not who I think I am, who am I? Feeling out of control, feeling like reality isn't what I thought it was, is extremely scary. So, all of that is a very long, roundabout way of saying that we all have control issues. We all like the things with the way they are. We all resist, strongly resist, anything that is going to threaten our sense of control. Hopefully you are resonating with this experience. And of course, if we are Christians, we have to say that control is an illusion after all, don't we? We easily profess the omnipotence of God, but we have a lot of trouble really believing it, and we have even more trouble giving up our illusion of control. We can easily, blithely say that we give everything over to God, but the reality is that it isn't that easy. What we can easily do is fool ourselves into thinking that we've let God be in control. To really let go of the illusion of control, to let God into our lives on a deep, fundamental level, is very difficult. It is the work of a lifetime. So what we will talk about next are some of the creative ways that our ego, our desire to feel like we are in control of our lives, can hinder our spiritual growth and relationship to God. Perhaps the best way we can sum up much of the problems of spiritual growth is to say that we want to avoid anything painful or uncomfortable. Now that is pretty obvious and natural, but we all know from experience that you can't always avoid the hard stuff in life. One way we avoid the hard stuff and thus fail to grow in our relationship with God is through what is known as spiritual bypassing. Now this is a concept that has been more developed in the Buddhist tradition, but it is very applicable to us as Christians. Spiritual bypassing happens when you are extremely focused on doing all the right spiritual practices, daily prayers, going to church, doing works of mercy, being a good, kind person, and, at the same time, ignoring or bypassing all the difficult, painful, dark aspects of your life. This kind of bypassing happens when you insist that you are never angry, upset, unkind, jealous, anything like that. You have eliminated all that from your life. With God's help, you have risen above all that. You're quite sure that with God's help, you've been transformed. People who write about spiritual bypassing call this being helicoptered to the top of the mountain. In other words, you feel like you have achieved a high level of spiritual maturity without having to slog your way through a lot of really difficult, painful, personal issues. Or you may just deny that you have any struggles. Spiritual bypassing is what happens when you say, "Oh no, I'm never angry or sad or hurt or whatever. I've just given it all over to God. Everything is fine now. I'm a Christian. Christians are joyful." This can be a way of denying that there are any painful, difficult issues in your life. In other words, we want to skip the difficult, messy, painful parts of life and say that our faith just makes everything okay. Unfortunately, this kind of denial or repression doesn't go away. It can easily prevent any kind of real spiritual growth or result in depression or other psychological problems. This kind of denial, insisting that everything is fine, skipping the hard inner work that is needed for spiritual transformation, is another example of an ego problem. Our ego likes to be in control. It wants to avoid pain or change or anything uncomfortable. By focusing on actions, behaviors, practices, we can pretend that we have become good, holy people without really being changed, without grappling with our deep brokenness and need for healing. In other words, you can't come to transformation without the hard work of letting go of egocentricity and letting God heal you. Another set of issues that are related to our ego, our illusion of control, are avoidance and resistance. Sometimes we suffer from the paradoxical situation of truly wanting and desiring a deeper prayer life and relationship with God, and yet at the same time we find ourselves avoiding or resisting what it takes to grow in relationship. We set aside a daily time for prayer and lectio, and then manage to find all kinds of excuses not to do it. We have trouble sitting still for prayer. We intend to read spiritual books but end up reading murder mysteries. We start programs with great intentions and then don't follow through. We may end up feeling a lot like our feline friend in the picture and feel like God is trying to drag us on our spiritual walk like this cat. As we've seen, this kind of resistance or avoidance is not unusual. If we are struggling with our prayer life, we don't need to think that we are rare, deeply flawed people. The reality is that we are pretty normal human beings who realize on some deep, probably unconscious level, that in order to come to transformation, we will have to let go of control, and that is scary. Our basic human instinct is to desire a relationship with God that lets us decide what kind of relationship we want with God. We would like God to be a giant teddy bear, always comforting, never challenging. We want the resurrection without having to go through the reality of the cross. When we realize, perhaps not even consciously, that to be who God wants us to be will be painful, we start to avoid the hard work. We resist prayer and spiritual activities. So what is the solution? Like most things in life, there isn't an easy, magic solution. If we begin by being aware of what is happening, we can begin to change. We can look at the roots of our avoidance and resistance, identify the parts of ourselves that resist letting go into God's presence. And we can take tiny, practical steps without getting caught up in guilt. If we are struggling with regular prayer or other practices, maybe we can cut down in order to encourage ourselves. If we can't pray for half an hour every day, then maybe we can do 5 minutes. Perhaps our regular prayer is a simple plea for the desire to pray. We may remind ourselves that every day is a new beginning, a new chance to know God's love. And more than anything, it is important to recognize how common these struggles are. They aren't a cause for guilt. They are a recognition of being human. As we said in the beginning, there are 2 broad categories of difficulties in prayer, getting bogged down on the spiritual journey. We have talked quite a bit about the issues that stem from our ego, our sense of self and our perception of our worth and our place in the world. But another set of spiritual challenges happens when God's presence seems to gradually diminish and disappear. In other words, for many people, the experience of prayer, their spiritual life in general, is a source of great consolation. They clearly experience God's presence, their prayer life is rich and empowering, they feel close to God and rejoice in their relationship. But it is very common for people to feel long periods of dryness in prayer. Gradually, the positive feelings may subside, and God feels less present, less intimate. There may be strong feelings of being abandoned by God. A person may have a great desire to pray, to become closer to God, but it feels like nothing is happening, or that they are doing something wrong. 2 of the great spiritual writers of the Christian tradition, Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, talk about this issue at great depth in their writings. Basically, they say that when these feelings of dryness or abandonment occur, it is actually an experience of much deeper growth in relationship to God. This sounds quite paradoxical because the feeling is quite painful. Teresa of Avila puts it this way: we are making the transition from desiring the consolations of God to desiring the God of consolations. In other words, do we just want the warm, fuzzy feelings, the consolations that come from God, or do we want to know God as God is? Can we be present in faith and trust in God even when we don't feel anything? Can we surrender to God even when we feel that we are in darkness? When this kind of painful dryness and darkness happens, we are being prepared for a much deeper relationship with God. This is the time when our ego can't help us. We finally experience what it means that God is in charge of our prayer life, not us. This is the painful, paradoxical experience of transformation. To be remade in God's image, we have to let go of our desire to be in control, to experience death and the cross, in order to come to the resurrection. This isn't the message we usually hear. What we hear from most spiritual writers, from the pulpits and conversations among spiritual people, is that to be faithful is to always feel God's consoling presence. The reality, though, is that as we progress on the journey, there will be times of darkness and struggle, and these can actually be the times of the greatest growth if we are able to let go and trust in the God who we cannot feel, who is bringing about change in the midst of our darkness.